Welcome to the story of the greatest heist in the history of mankind. The story of how trillions of dollars were slowly and systematically stolen. The story of how India's riches were drained under British colonial rule. During the British Raj, Britain extracted wealth from India worth approximately $45 trillion in today's money. To put that in perspective, that's more than 15 times the current GDP of the United Kingdom. It's enough money to end world poverty 7 times over. And it happened through one of the most sophisticated systems of economic exploitation the world has ever seen. This isn't just history, it's the story of how an entire subcontinent was systematically drained of its wealth, its resources, and its future. How a land that once accounted for 23% of the world's economy was reduced to one of the poorest regions on Earth, and how the effects of that exploitation still echo through modern India today. This is the story of how Britain drained India's wealth. Before we talk about what was taken, we need to understand what was there. Because the India that Britain encountered in the 17th century wasn't some backward, primitive society waiting to be civilized. It was an economic powerhouse. In 1600, when the British East India Company received its royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, India's economy was flourishing. The Mughal Empire, under emperors like Akbar and later Shah Jahan, had created one of the most prosperous civilizations on Earth. India's share of the world economy was approximately 23%. By comparison, all of Europe combined accounted for just under 20%. India wasn't just rich, it was the manufacturing hub of the world. Indian textiles were legendary. Muslin from Dhaka was so fine, so delicate, that a full outfit could be passed through a wedding ring. European aristocrats paid fortunes for Indian silk and cotton. The word calico comes from Calicut, an Indian port city. Chintz comes from the Hindi word chint. Even the word shampoo derives from the Hindi champo. India's pre-colonial economy wasn't just about textiles. Indian steel was the finest in the world. Damascus swords, legendary for their sharpness and strength, were made from Indian wootz steel. Indian shipbuilders constructed vessels that were stronger and more durable than their European counterparts. The agricultural system was sophisticated and productive. India exported sugar, indigo, opium, rice, and spices across the known world. The famous spice trade that drew Europeans to Asia in the first place, India was at its heart. Trade routes connected India to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, East Africa, and even parts of Europe. Indian merchants operated across the Indian Ocean with their own banking systems, insurance mechanisms, and trade networks. The economy was monetized, urbanized, and commercially advanced. Cities like Delhi, Agra, Surat, and Dhaka rivaled or exceeded European capitals in size and sophistication. When the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal in the 1600s, it wasn't just a monument to love. It was a demonstration of India's immense wealth and architectural capability. India's GDP per capita in 1600 was comparable to that of Western Europe. In some estimates, Indian laborers and artisans earned wages similar to their English counterparts. This was the India that Britain encountered. Wealthy, productive, self-sufficient. So how did the British East India Company, a private trading corporation, end up controlling this vast, prosperous land? It started, as these things often do, with trade. The British East India Company arrived in India in the early 1600s, seeking access to Indian goods. They established trading posts, or factories, in coastal cities like Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. At first, they were just one of many foreign trading groups. The Portuguese, Dutch, and French all had similar operations. The Mughal emperors tolerated them because trade was profitable. The company paid taxes, followed local laws, and enriched Indian merchants and the imperial treasury. But the British East India Company was different. It wasn't just a trading company. It was a corporation with its own army, its own navy, and its own political ambitions. By the mid-1700s, the Mughal Empire was fragmenting. Regional powers were asserting independence. Political instability created opportunities, and the British East India Company seized them. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. Robert Clive, an officer of the company, defeated the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of military force and bribery. Clive convinced the Nawab's military commander, Mir Jafar, to betray his ruler in exchange for being installed as the new Nawab. The battle itself was barely a battle, it was a coup. But its consequences were catastrophic for India. After Plassey, the British East India Company gained control of Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India. Bengal alone had an economy larger than Britain's at the time. Its textile industry was unmatched. Its agricultural output fed millions, and now, a private British corporation controlled it. In 1765, the company was granted the Diwani of Bengal by the Mughal emperor. This meant the company had the right to collect taxes across the entire province. Think about that for a moment. A foreign corporation now had the legal authority to tax an entire population. This was the beginning of the end, because what the British East India Company did next would set the template for 2 centuries of exploitation. They didn't come to India to trade anymore. They came to extract. Once the British East India Company controlled Bengal's tax system, everything changed. The relationship between Britain and India transformed from trade to tribute, from partnership to plunder. Let me explain how the system worked, because it's both brilliant and horrifying in its design. Before British rule, Indian artisans and farmers operated in a relatively balanced economy. They paid taxes to local rulers, but those taxes were reinvested locally. Roads were built, irrigation systems maintained, armies paid, administrators supported. The wealth circulated within India, but under the British East India Company and later the British Raj, the system was redesigned. Indian taxes no longer stayed in India. Instead, they flowed directly to Britain. This was called the drain of wealth, and it became the defining feature of British colonialism in India. Here's how it worked in practice. The company collected massive land taxes from Indian farmers. These taxes were often 50% or more of agricultural output, sometimes higher. The taxes had to be paid in cash, not in goods, which forced farmers into debt. If they couldn't pay, their land was confiscated. The collected revenue was then used to buy Indian goods, textiles, opium, indigo, cotton, which were shipped to Britain or sold in other markets. But here's the key. India was never paid for these goods in currency. Instead, the payment was recorded as a credit in London. Indian merchants and producers were essentially issuing IOUs to Britain that were never repaid. This system meant that India was exporting enormous quantities of goods but receiving almost nothing in return. Economist Utsa Patnaik has calculated that during their rule, Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion in today's value from India through this mechanism. That's not an exaggeration. That's a conservative estimate based on historical trade data. But the drain of wealth was just one part of the exploitation. Let's talk about deindustrialization. Remember, India in 1700 was a manufacturing powerhouse. Indian textile dominated global markets. British consumers loved Indian cotton and silk. But British manufacturers hated the competition. So the British government did something extraordinary. They destroyed India's textile industry. First, they imposed tariffs on Indian textiles entering Britain, making them uncompetitive. Tariffs reached 70% to 80% by the early 1800s. At the same time, British textiles entering India faced little to no tariffs. The market was rigged, but it gets worse. The British colonial administration actively dismantled India's manufacturing base. Weavers in Bengal and other regions were forced to sell their products exclusively to the British East India Company at prices far below market value. If they refused or tried to sell to others, they faced brutal punishment. There are documented cases of weavers having their thumbs cut off to prevent them from working. Entire communities of artisans were driven into poverty. By the mid-1800s, India's share of global manufacturing had collapsed. From 23% of world GDP in 1700, India fell to less than 2% by 1950. Meanwhile, Britain's Industrial Revolution was powered, in significant part, by cheap Indian cotton. Indian raw materials were shipped to British factories, turned into finished goods, and then sold back to India at inflated prices. India went from being a net exporter of finished textiles to an importer. The economic impact was devastating. Millions of Indian artisans lost their livelihoods, rural economies collapsed, and India became dependent on British manufactured goods. But even this doesn't capture the full horror of British economic policies in India. Because those policies didn't just impoverish India, they killed millions of Indians. Let's talk about the famines. Between 1765 and 1947, India experienced some of the deadliest famines in human history. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, roughly one-third of Bengal's population. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 killed between 5 and 10 million people across India. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed approximately 3 million people. Historians estimate that between 30 and 60 million Indians died in famines during British rule. Now, famines had occurred in India before British colonialism. Droughts and crop failures are natural phenomena. But what made these famines so deadly was British policy. During the 1770 Bengal famine, the British East India Company continued to collect full land taxes even as people starved. They exported grain from Bengal to other markets while millions died. Profit took priority over human life. During the 1876 famine, the British colonial government, led by Viceroy Lord Lytton, continued to export record amounts of wheat from India. At the same time, they reduced relief efforts, arguing that aid would create dependency. Lytton even hosted a lavish banquet in Delhi, the imperial assemblage, to celebrate Queen Victoria being proclaimed Empress of India. While millions starved, the British elite feasted. Winston Churchill, during the 1943 Bengal famine, diverted food shipments away from India to build stockpiles for British soldiers and European civilians. When officials pleaded for relief, Churchill reportedly asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the famine was so bad. Churchill blamed Indians themselves, claiming they breed like rabbits. These weren't natural disasters, they were policy choices. British economic policies prioritized extraction and profit over Indian lives. The famines were a direct result of colonial economic exploitation. Food was available. It was simply being exported or hoarded, while Indians starved. Let me give you a specific example to make this real. Imagine you're a farmer in rural Bengal in 1770. You've just harvested your rice crop. It's been a difficult year. The monsoons were weak. The yield is lower than usual. A British tax collector arrives. He demands 60% of your harvest as land tax. You try to explain that you need the rice to feed your family through the year. He doesn't care. The tax must be paid in full, or your land will be seized. You hand over more than half your crop. A few months later, your family runs out of food. You go to the market. There's no rice available. It's all been collected as tax and shipped to Calcutta for export. Prices for what little remains have skyrocketed. You can't afford it. Your children begin to starve. You hear that thousands of others in nearby villages are in the same situation. Bodies line the roads. You watch your family waste away, and in Calcutta, British merchants are loading ships with Indian grain, bound for overseas markets. This happened to millions of people. Not once, but repeatedly, across 2 centuries. This is the human cost of the British economic policies in India. Beyond the famines, British rule restructured India's entire economy to serve British interests. India was forced to grow cash crops like indigo, opium, and cotton instead of food crops. Farmers were compelled to sell these crops to British merchants at fixed prices far below market value. The opium trade is particularly instructive. The British colonial government held a monopoly on opium production in India. Indian farmers were forced to grow opium, which was then sold to China, creating millions of addicts and triggering the Opium Wars. The profits flowed to Britain and the colonial administration. India bore the cost. Agricultural land diverted from food production and the moral stain of the drug trade. Infrastructure projects like railways are often cited as benefits of British rule. But the railways weren't built for India's benefit. They were built to extract resources more efficiently. Railways moved raw materials from India's interior to ports for export. They moved British manufactured goods into India's interior for sale, and they moved British troops to suppress Indian resistance. The railways were paid for by Indian taxes, but designed to serve British economic interests. Even the administrative structure of British India was designed for extraction. The colonial government spent vast sums on the British Indian Army, which was used not primarily to defend India, but to fight Britain's wars across Asia and Africa. Indian soldiers fought in Burma, Afghanistan, China, and both world wars. But India paid for this army through taxes. By the early 1900s, nearly 50% of India's government budget went to military expenses. Meanwhile, spending on education, health, and infrastructure for Indians was minimal. Literacy rates remained below 20%. Life expectancy was in the 30 seconds. Poverty was endemic. All while India was generating enormous wealth that flowed to Britain. This is what economic exploitation looks like at scale. It's not just unfair trade deals or high taxes. It's the systematic restructuring of an entire economy to serve a foreign power. It's the deliberate destruction of local industries to eliminate competition. It's the prioritization of profit over human life, even in the face of mass starvation. And it's the extraction of wealth on a scale so vast that it shaped the modern world. Because here's the thing. Britain's rise and India's decline are not separate stories. They're two sides of the same coin. When India gained independence in 1947, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. Life expectancy was 32 years. Literacy was 12%. Per capita income was among the lowest globally. India's share of the world economy had fallen from 23% in 1700 to less than 4%. This wasn't an accident. This was the direct result of 2 centuries of systematic economic exploitation. The British often claim they civilized India, that they brought modern governance, rule of law, and infrastructure. But the numbers tell a different story. When the British arrived, India was wealthier than Britain. When they left, India was incomparably poorer. If British rule had been beneficial, you'd expect to see rising living standards, growing GDP, and improving quality of life. Instead, you see the opposite. India's economy stagnated under British rule. GDP per capita barely grew, and in many periods, it declined. Meanwhile, Britain's economy boomed. The wealth extracted from India helped finance Britain's industrial revolution. It funded the expansion of the British Empire. It built British infrastructure, cities, and institutions. Economic historian Angus Maddison estimated that India's per capita GDP declined by nearly 0.2% per year during British rule. That might sound small, but over 200 years, it's catastrophic. For comparison, China, which faced its own challenges during this period, saw its economy stagnate but not decline at the same rate. And countries that weren't colonized, like Thailand, maintained economic growth. India's impoverishment was not inevitable. It was a policy outcome. Let's talk about what $45 trillion means for modern India. If that wealth had remained in India and been invested at even modest returns, India today would likely be the world's largest economy. Instead, India is still recovering from centuries of extraction. Poverty, while declining, still affects hundreds of millions. Infrastructure gaps are massive. Educational and health outcomes lag behind India's economic potential. These aren't just legacies of underdevelopment. They're the ongoing consequences of colonial exploitation. But the impact goes beyond economics. British colonialism reshaped Indian society in profound ways. The British exacerbated communal divisions, particularly between Hindus and Muslims, as a strategy of divide and rule. The partition of India in 1947, which led to one of the largest and bloodiest mass migrations in history, was in part a consequence of these policies. An estimated 1 to 2 million people died in partition violence. Millions more were displaced. The trauma of that event still shapes India and Pakistan today. British colonialism also imposed a cultural and psychological legacy. English was established as the language of administration and elite education, creating linguistic hierarchies that persist. Western knowledge systems were prioritized over indigenous ones. Traditional industries, crafts, and knowledge were devalued. This cultural subordination had long-lasting effects on Indian identity and self-perception. It took decades after independence for India to begin reclaiming its own narrative. Now, some argue that discussing colonial exploitation is dwelling on the past, that India should move on and focus on the future. But history isn't just about the past, it shapes the present. Understanding how India was impoverished helps us understand why certain challenges persist today. It also raises questions of justice. If Britain extracted $45 trillion from India, does Britain owe reparations? This is a live debate. In 2015, Indian politician Shashi Tharoor argued at the Oxford Union that Britain does owe reparations to India. His speech went viral, reigniting global conversations about colonial accountability. Tharoor pointed out that Britain has never formally apologized for colonialism, let alone offered restitution. Britain's response has generally been to acknowledge colonialism's complexity while avoiding responsibility for its worst abuses. Some British officials have expressed regret, but this falls short of accountability. Compare this to Germany's approach to Holocaust reparations, or even Britain's payment of reparations to slave owners, not slaves, after abolishing slavery. The question isn't whether colonial exploitation happened. The historical evidence is overwhelming. The question is what, if anything, should be done about it. Reparations could take many forms. Direct financial payments, funding for education and infrastructure, return of looted cultural artifacts, thousands of which sit in British museums, formal apologies and acknowledgement of historical injustice. But beyond reparations, there's a broader issue: how history is taught and remembered. In Britain, colonial history is often glossed over or presented through a lens of imperial nostalgia. Polls show many Britons are proud of the British Empire and believe it did more good than harm. This reflects a profound ignorance of what colonialism actually entailed. In India, the memory of colonialism shapes national identity, but it's also politically contested. Different groups emphasize different aspects of the independence, struggle, and colonial experience. The point is that this history matters. It's not abstract. It affects how nations relate to each other, how economic inequalities are understood, and how justice is pursued. Let me bring this full circle. India today is the world's fifth largest economy and growing rapidly. It's a nuclear power, a spacefaring nation, and a major player in global technology. Indian entrepreneurs and professionals shape the global economy. This resurgence is remarkable given where India started in 1947. But imagine where India could be if it hadn't lost $45 trillion. If its industries hadn't been destroyed, if its people hadn't been starved and impoverished for 2 centuries. India's rise today isn't happening because of British colonialism. It's happening despite it. And the same is true for many formerly colonized nations. The wealth of the West and the poverty of the global South are not accidents of geography or culture. They're the products of historical processes, including colonialism, that systematically transferred wealth from one part of the world to another. Understanding this doesn't mean ignoring agency or local factors. It means seeing the full picture. So what's the takeaway? First, history has consequences. The economic structures created during colonialism, patterns of trade, investment, and power, persist today. Second, economic exploitation isn't just about money. It's about lives, opportunities, and futures stolen. The millions who died in famines, the generations trapped in poverty, the cultures and industries destroyed. These are the human costs of colonial economics. Third, acknowledging this history is essential for justice. Whether through reparations, apologies, or simply honest education, confronting the past is necessary. And finally, this story should make us ask, what systems of exploitation exist today? Global economic inequality didn't end with colonialism. It evolved. Understanding how Britain drained India's wealth helps us see similar patterns in contemporary global economics. The structures may have changed, but the dynamics of wealth, extraction, debt, trade imbalances, resource exploitation often look strikingly familiar. India's story under British rule is one of the greatest robberies in history. But it's also a story of resilience. Despite everything, India survived. It rebuilt, and today, it's reclaiming its place in the world. The question is whether the world is ready to reckon honestly with how that wealth was taken, and what, if anything, should be done about it. If you found this documentary valuable, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden economic histories that shaped our world. History isn't just dates and names, it's money, power, and the lives of billions. And understanding it is the first step toward a more just future. Thanks for watching.